right?
The transverse lines.
Alright. So if we're looking at the skull, we're going to start by looking at the cranial bones, which are all going to come into contact with the brain, and then we're going to look at the facial bones. So as we look at this, the first cranial bone that we want to look at is going to be the frontal bone. Now for the frontal, the main features you want to pay attention to are going to be the supraorbital margins, which are these regions here. And typically on the margins there, you would have a supraorbital notch or supraorbital foramen if there's an actual foramen there. And so that's the frontal bone. Going posterior from there, you have your two parietal bones. As far as the articulations between the two parietal bones, you have the sagittal suture, and then the articulation between the parietal bones and the frontal, you have your coronal suture. Continuing on to the posterior aspect, you have your occipital bone. Articulating the occipital bone to the parietals, you have your lambdoid suture, the lambdoidal. On the lateral aspect, we see the temporal bone. And articulating that to the parietals, you have your squamous suture. So those are the bones from the external feature, external anatomy. As we go into the internal anatomy, the bones that are visible here are the sphenoid. And so the sphenoid makes up the anterior part of the middle cranial fossa. As you move anterior to that, you see part of the ethmoid. And the visible features of the ethmoid here are going to be the crista galli and the cribriform plate, which contains the cribriform foramina. If we come back to the sphenoid, as far as the features that are visible here, you see the greater wings, the lesser wings, the hypophyseal fossa or sella turcica. You have the body of the sphenoid, and then you're going to start with the foramen, starting with the most lateral, which is the foramen spinosum, followed by the foramen ovale, moving anterior here to the foramen rotundum, then the superior orbital fissure, and the optic canal, just inferior to the lesser wing. So those are all the foramen and features of the sphenoid that we're concerned with here on the internal aspect. If we look at the inferior aspect of the skull, we do see the pterygoid processes of the sphenoid here. So you have the medial and lateral plates of those pterygoid processes. And these are going to function for muscle attachments. If we look at the lateral aspect here on the external anatomy, we do see the external portion of the greater wings of the sphenoid. So you can kind of see the suture there, and those would be the greater wings. As far as the facial bones, we have our two nasal bones here, which form the superior aspect of the bridge of the nose. As you go in towards the orbit, you see the lacrimal bones that make up part of this lacrimal fossa. As you go inferior to those, you see the maxilla. Right, and we have right and left maxilla. The biggest feature that you can see from the anterior view here is going to be the infraorbital foramen. Lateral to the maxilla, you have your zygomatic bone. And as far as some of the features here, you have the temporal process of the zygomatic bone that's going to articulate with the zygomatic process of the temporal bone to form the zygomatic arch. You also have the frontal process of the zygomatic bone, and then the maxillary process of the zygomatic bone that articulate with those respective bones. So we make our way down, we see the mandible. So this is one solid bone here, making up the jaw. As far as some of the features here, the regions include the body, the angle, and the ramus. Along the body you have the mental foramen on both sides. As we make our way up towards the ramus, you have the coronoid process, the mandibular notch, and the condylar process, which articulates in the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone, and it forms that articulation there. Unless you do a hinge. If we look at the internal aspect or the internal portion of the mandible, this is where you find the mandibular foramen. And again, all these foramen in life are going to allow blood vessels or nerves to pass through them. If we look at the nasal cavity, the bones we're going to see here One individual bone you see here is the vomer, which forms the inferior portion of the nasal septum, the inferior posterior portion. Just lateral to that, you see the inferior nasal conchae, and just superior to that, you can see the middle nasal conchae. The middle nasal conchae, and those are actually part of the ethmoid bone. The other part of the ethmoid bone that's visible here is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, and this makes up part of the nasal septum as well. If we go back to the inferior aspect here, some of the features that you can see here, making up the hard palate, you have the palatine process of the maxilla. So this is the palatine process of the maxilla. At the very posterior end of this hard palate, you do have the palatine bones that are seen here. And then in between, you see the posterior portion of the vomer. And that vomer then makes its way anterior to form part of that nasal septum. On the inferior aspect now of the occipital bone, some of the features that are visible here: the external occipital protuberance with the superior and inferior nuchal lines. You have the foramen magnum, the occipital condyles. Here's your jugular foramen. Just in front of that, you have the carotid canal. And anterior to that, you see the foramen lacerum, which the foramen lacerum is not a true foramen. It's kind of the junction of where the occipital, the temporal, and the sphenoid bones meet. That's where they come together. And then a few of the last features here, you have your mastoid process, the styloid process that you can see there, and where the mandibular condyle is articulated, the condylar or mandibular fossa. I think those are the major